After eluding the U.S. for several decades, America's top geopolitical rival is now trying to accomplish something it couldn't: peace in the Middle East. On Wednesday, Chinese President Xi Jinping rolled out the red carpet with full military honors as he met with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas in Beijing. During their meeting, Xi said justice must be returned to Palestine as soon as possible. Xi put forward a three-part proposal for a two-state solution to the decades-long conflict that included an independent Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Abbas, who last visited China back in 2017, said he would continue to enhance cooperation with Beijing. The meeting comes as Palestinians continue to voice concern over a lack of progress from the Biden administration, who has yet to reopen its consulate in Jerusalem or arrange a visit by Abbas to the White House. But China, fresh off its success in brokering a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran to resume diplomatic ties, is looking to expand its influence across a region long dominated by U.S. interests. And to further discuss Beijing's growing ambitions in the Middle East, joining me now from London is Jane Kinnaman. She is the Policy and Impact Director at the European Leadership Network. And Jacopo Schita, he is a Policy Fellow at the Bourse and Bazaar Foundation. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me on Straight Talk. Jane, how deep does the relationship between the two nations go?
Chinese and Palestinian relations have a long history. But in recent years, China has also tried to balance those with good relations with Israel. So it's striking now that it is taking these measures to bolster the leader of the Palestinian Authority. It's striking also that it's the only major power that is putting itself forward as a country that can broker intra-Palestinian dialogue. And that means, of course, talking to Hamas, something that the US and the EU are unwilling and even legally unable to do.
So what could, Jacopo, China offer to Palestinians to achieve internal reconciliation between the, let's say, not warring factions, but Palestinian Authority and Hamas?
Well, I think, that's what China aims to do somehow, or aims to portray itself to be able to do. I'm very skeptical they can achieve something like that. Of course, when it comes to Hamas, one can argue that they have China has very good relations with Iran. So this can sort of being their sort of card they can play. But I think, honestly, that broadly speaking, what China is doing is very much virtue signaling. I don't see them able and effectively willing to achieve something like that. So this is an interesting stand that is very important, that has a lot of implication in terms of how China tried to portray itself. But in practical terms, I don't see this going anywhere.
So, Jane, the two countries have elevated their relationship to a strategic partnership level. What does that mean? And what's at stake for China to have closer ties with Palestinians?
Well, usually, these things are announced as a big strategic partnership, but it takes quite some time for the details to really come out in terms of what that partnership will offer. The Palestinians, of course, will be hoping that in particular it will be more support for Palestinian statehood, and that it will give them a boost at a time when their traditional Arab allies have been signing agreements with Israel that appear to bypass the Palestinians. And I think this will be meaningful, but I agree with Jacopo, it's not going to change something now. The conflict is very entrenched. Mahmoud Abbas is not really going to reconcile with Hamas. The current Israeli government is not moving on the two-state solution. But this is sending a signal about where one of the world's rising powers is going, and how the region might actually come to change if the US is not as active a player as it was for the past decade.
So, Jacopo, how has the U.S.'s disproportionate support towards Israel created a room for China to maneuver?
Well, yes, of course. I totally agree with what Jane was saying. And I think, what we can add to have a sort of a big picture about this is that it's good and important to see what China is doing, this attempt to mediate in many conflicts in the region, as a sort of a broad response to the US policy in the Middle East. China is fundamentally trying to portray itself as a different actor, as a different great power with different goals, with a different style of diplomacy, and a country that actually cares about regional conflicts. We had the same thing going on with Iran and Saudi Arabia. So China stepped in and tried to portray itself as a different mediator compared to the United States. And I think of course the Palestinians are looking for a great power that is willing to at least show support on their cause. And for sure this is not, or at least partly is not, the United States and China as a sort of an open field to maneuver in that.
So, Jane, do you see any parallels or similarities in methods used by China to broker a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and now Israel and Palestine, possibly, of course?
I mean, this Israel-Palestine issue is far, far harder. With Iran and Saudi Arabia, China was really coming as the guarantor of a process that had already begun in the region, where both Iran and Saudi Arabia wanted an external power to help nudge that over the finish line. We have exactly the opposite situation with Israel and the Palestinians, because the leaders on the ground are not moving. And this current Israeli government has many members who have said that they don't ever want to see a Palestinian state. The Palestinian leaders are divided, etc. So China is not working with a group of local leaders to mediate between them. Instead, what it is saying basically is that it will stand up for the principles of international law and the previous multilateral agreements that most countries in the world agree with, but which have never been implemented. So it's a really strong signal, but what ability do they have currently to implement it? They may begin to affect the calculations of Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu has prided himself on being able to build relations across the global south with Russia, India, Philippines, all sorts of countries. This will be a kind of warning to him that things may not go as smoothly, but it's not going to show tangible results anytime soon.
So, Jacopo, I mean, how do you think Arab and Gulf countries are viewing China's potential role as a key mediator?
Well, I think they will welcome it, even though I think, despite a lot of the portraits we see of Gulf countries' approach to China as a sort of naive and so on, they are very much aware that this is totally different, as Jane was saying, from the role that China had in the Saudi-Iran mediation. But of course they will welcome it because, to be fair, China and the Gulf countries are living in an honeymoon right now. And the Gulf countries are very much interested and willing in having more China in the region. They are betting on this notion of a multipolar world. So they are quite happy to see China getting involved, to see China showing interest and care about an issue that is certainly still at the center of the Arab public opinion. Mm-hmm. So I don't see any Gulf countries having nothing against China, somehow, trying to manage and emerge as a mediator in this.
So, Jane, how do you think Israel is reacting to the strategic partnership between the two nations? I mean, does it have any influence over China to steer how it approaches to peace talks?
Israel and China have been increasing their economic ties in recent years, but quite cautiously. I don't think it's quite at the point where either of them has massive influence over the other. But China will be moving cautiously with this. It will be trying to balance not just Israel and the Palestinians, but also its relationship with all of the other countries in the region. So they're not coming in trying to do something that is very radical. And all of the political goals, as I say, are kind of framed within existing international law and multilateral understandings. But I just think it is something that will make Israel pause and think when they think about their long-term strategy. Because like most countries in the Middle East, Israel doesn't want to be dependent only on the US forever. They are trying to prepare themselves for a multipolar world where they will have to have more diversified relationships. So they will also be trying to think about how can they find ways to build their relations with China in ways that have nothing to do with the Palestinians. How can they make themselves more useful to China so that China is less likely to end up taking sides?
So, Jacopo, what do you think? I mean, how much of an influence could China exercise on Israel on this particular matter?
Honestly, I don't think much influence to be totally fair, because as Jane was saying perfectly, both countries, both Israel and China, do not hold much leverage on each other, and I don't really think that China is particularly interested in sort of leveraging Israel to do something specific on the Palestinian case. As Jane was saying, this is a pretty standard proposal. It's nothing new. It's all along the line of international law, of old agreements and so on. So it's nothing out of the box somehow. And again, I think it shows that China cares. I think it shows that China wants to be sort of a main character or a leading character in this. But it doesn't say that they will sort of leverage Israel, or they try to put pressure on Israel to change their behavior in the region. So I think right now what we're seeing is something that is very good on paper, but it will hardly be translated into strong political and diplomatic action.
So, Jane, isn't it ironic that it is China who brought up this marginalized issue to the international community's attention once again? And could Israel and Palestinian peace negotiations, as we all know, which were stalled in 2014, resume soon? Now the international community has eye on it because of China.
I don't think they will resume soon because there is so little will on the part of the leaders to talk to one another. And that is partly because these leaders on both sides, Abbas and Netanyahu, they have been around for a really long time. They are heavily set in their ways. They are completely focused on maintaining their domestic political position in different ways. Abbas is thinking about the succession to him as a president who has not been elected for a very long time and is aging. Netanyahu is thinking about trying to preserve his immunity so that ultimately he doesn't go to jail. So they have other priorities. They dislike each other. They don't trust each other. They are the last people who are going to move. But they will not be there forever. And there is probably more scope in having an approach that is regional and multilateral. Try to actually leverage the Abraham Accords to do something for the Palestinians, even though they totally left the Palestinians out of the idea at the beginning. Bring in all of the Arab countries that now have peace agreements with Israel, dangle the carrot of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. When the region works together, there is a lot that can be worked on. It doesn't have to be zero sum. There is also something that China would be likely to focus on is using a peace agreement eventually as grounds for economic cooperation. But none of this is happening under the current Israeli and Palestinian leaders.
All right, Jane and Jacopo, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.